In the final winter of World War II, American soldiers pushed through the forests of western Germany expecting minefields, ambushes, and fanatical last-stand defenders. They did not expect this. Buried beneath farmhouses, hidden behind false barn walls, concealed under ancient forests, the Allies began stumbling onto a secret industrial world the Nazis never intended anyone to see. A world of underground launch chambers, unfinished tunnels that ran for miles, and mysterious steel assemblies unlike any weapon they had ever encountered. Some men thought they had found abandoned factories. Others believed they had stepped into the remains of some impossible superweapon program. But when engineers finally identified the twisted metal frames and massive concrete vaults, one phrase echoed across the American lines. These are V-weapon sites, and they were meant for London, maybe even for us. This is the story of what U.S. soldiers saw, what they said, and why these discoveries changed the war's final months and the world that followed. By early 1945, the war in Western Europe was supposed to be entering its final, grinding phase. After the shattering violence of the Battle of the Bulge, American forces pushed eastward through the Schnee-Eifel Ridge into the Huichen Forest and toward the northern approaches of the Rhine. The enemy was still dangerous, still capable of ambushes and counterattacks, but the strategic momentum was gone. To the men of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, these woods were not supposed to hold surprises anymore. The soldiers advancing that winter knew exactly what to expect. The Huichen had already earned its reputation as one of the most unforgiving battlefields in Europe. They had learned to scan every tree line for the flash of an MG-42, to check every mound of snow for a concealed Panzerfaust team, to treat every abandoned bunker as if it were wired to explode. German positions here were often grim relics of earlier fighting, scarred concrete, collapsed trenches, and dugouts crudely reinforced with timber. But as patrols pushed deeper into sectors that intelligence officers had labeled low threat, something felt off. The forest itself seemed altered. This wasn't the shattered ruin of previous months. It was quiet, too quiet, as if the fighting had skipped this pocket entirely. That was when soldiers began to find the first anomalies. Near a frozen creek bed, a squad from the 9th Infantry Division stopped dead in their tracks. Embedded in the hillside was a slab of fresh concrete, smooth, unweathered, and poured with a precision that had no place in a forest supposedly abandoned by the Wehrmacht. A few hundred yards beyond it, another patrol found ventilation shafts, rising from the snow like metal chimneys. Warm air drifted upward, fogging in the cold, a sign of machinery working somewhere beneath their feet. Then came the rails, narrow-gauge steel tracks that cut through the underbrush before disappearing directly into a hillside. Not around it, not over it, into it, as if the forest floor were just a camouflage curtain hiding something far larger. None of this matched any known German defensive position. The breakthrough came when a reconnaissance element from the 99th Infantry Division radioed back to their battalion headquarters. The patrol leader's voice was steady but unmistakably shaken. "Sir, we found a tunnel entrance, but it doesn't look military, it looks industrial." For months, Allied intelligence had pieced together reports of Germany's desperate shift underground, an attempt to shield its weapon production from the relentless Allied bombing campaign that had destroyed factories from Hamburg to Munich. Beginning in 1943, the Reich had poured immense resources into subterranean complexes, aircraft assembly halls, synthetic fuel plants, storage depots, and increasingly experimental weapon sites hidden beneath mountains and forests. But no one expected to find one here, in the shattered remains of the Huichen. Within hours, engineer units were rerouted to the sector. What they found forced American commanders to revise their operational maps overnight. This wasn't a bunker network or a defensive redoubt left over from the Bulge. The ground beneath the forest was hollow. The concrete was new. The tunnels were vast, and the machinery still running inside had a purpose the infantry had never trained for. As engineers prepared to breach the entrance, one officer summed up the growing sense of unease, staring at the rails vanishing into the darkness. "This isn't a bunker," he muttered. "This was a factory built to fire something." Fear in wartime is rarely abstract. It becomes real the moment a weapon proves it can kill without warning, without sound, without even offering its victims a chance to run. By 1944, Germany had created such weapons, and the world had witnessed the consequences. To understand why Allied troops were suddenly finding sealed tunnels, fresh concrete, and industrial-scale machinery buried inside remote forests, one must return to the origins of Hitler's most ambitious and destructive gamble, the Vergeltungswaffen, the weapons of vengeance. The first of these, the V-1 flying bomb, entered combat in June 1944. Crude yet terrifyingly effective, it was powered by an Argus pulse-jet engine that produced a distinctive chattering roar, a mechanical heartbeat that Londoners soon learned to identify instantly. With a range of roughly 160 miles, it could be fired from northern France and Belgium, riding an automated gyrocompass toward its target at around 400 miles per hour. More than 8,000 V-1s were launched at London alone. Thousands more were fired at Antwerp, Liège, and other strategic ports supporting the Allied advance. The sound of a V-1 abruptly cutting out, the moment its engine stopped and it began to fall, became one of the most chilling silences of the war. But the V-1 was only the beginning. By the autumn of 1944, Germany unveiled a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, the V-2, the first operational ballistic missile in human history. It rose from mobile launch platforms, accelerated to the edge of space, then plunged downward faster than the speed of sound. There was no defense, no warning, no possibility of interception. A V-2 struck its target before the sound of its descent could even be heard. The first London impact, on 8 September 1944, left a crater 20 feet deep and killed 3 civilians. By the time the campaign ended, 2,754 people in London had been killed by V-2 strikes. These were the results Hitler wanted: terror, uncertainty, and the hope, however unrealistic, that such weapons might shatter Allied morale after the RAF and USAAF had reduced German cities to smoldering ruins. With the Luftwaffe losing air superiority and conventional industry being pulverized by round-the-clock bombing, the Nazi leadership pushed for radical solutions. Production lines hidden in forests, assembly halls buried in mountains, fuel-mixing stations cut into bedrock. Anything that could be built above ground risked being destroyed within hours. Thus emerged a dispersed, clandestine network: Mail-Norwegian transporters to move V-2 missiles through forest roads, mobile firing tables to launch them from fields and clearings, and enormous underground facilities like Mittelwerk in the Harz Mountains to assemble them far from Allied bombers. Every component, ethanol fuel, liquid oxygen, gyroscopes, turbopumps, required specialized workshops shielded from the sky. By late 1944, Allied intelligence had begun noticing unusual markings on captured maps, particularly during the Ardennes offensive. The documents referenced Sonderanlagen, special installations, but provided no descriptions, no diagrams, no precise functions. Just symbols scattered across Belgium, the Eifel, and the Rhine hinterlands. Commanders assumed they were related to V-1 or V-2 operations, until ground forces reached them and discovered nothing that matched any known launch site architecture. No ski ramp structures used for V-1s. No open firing positions used for V-2s. No mobile support layout recognizable to engineers trained on captured German manuals. Something else was being built. As U.S. patrols moved deeper into the forests of Western Germany, they began finding structures that defied every expectation: massive ventilation systems, reinforced underground galleries, and machinery that looked nothing like the equipment linked to the known V-weapon programs. If these weren't V-1 ramps, and they weren't V-2 bunkers, then what were they building out there? The first major discovery came on a gray, windless morning, when a platoon advancing through a patch of farmland noticed something wrong with a barn that should have been abandoned. Its exterior walls were too new, too straight, too precisely joined for a structure supposedly left behind in a retreat. When engineers were brought forward and peeled back the boards, the illusion collapsed instantly. The barn wall swung open like a stage prop, revealing a reinforced concrete portal cut directly into the earth. The air that drifted out was heavy with chemical sharpness, oil, solvent, cooling metal, not the stale, earthy scent of an old storage shed. It smelled alive, as though the machines inside had only just stopped. What lay beyond the doorway felt less like a bunker, and more like an industrial artery running beneath the countryside. The first tunnel dropped sharply, lined with thick electrical conduits and fresh welding seams that still glistened in the beam of a flashlight. On the floor, thin steel tracks ran straight into the dark, the kind used for heavy transport carts. A squad leader brushed his glove across them and felt warmth, residual heat from loads moved recently. One soldier muttered under his breath, "Whatever this is, it ain't a bunker." Far below the surface, the galleries widened into enormous halls. Some were flooded ankle-deep, reflecting ceiling lamps that dangled uselessly, as if power had been cut only hours before. Others were still electrified. When engineers restored fuses, whole sections flickered back to life, revealing rows of workbenches, gantry cranes, and lifting rigs large enough to hoist vehicles. But none of it matched known V1 or V2 facilities. In one chamber, the teams found liquid oxygen storage tanks, thick-walled and insulated, essential components for advanced rocket propulsion. Nearby stood pressure-resistant fueling rooms, equipped with reinforced blast doors and drainage channels designed for volatile mixtures. And then came the most disturbing finds: enormous skeletal frames, incomplete, but unmistakably meant for something far larger than the standard V2. An engineer, examining the scale of one assembly cradle, whispered that it looked sized for a rocket the length of a railcar. Another added, "Feels like they were building rockets the size of trains." As officers took notes, a darker truth emerged in the shadows between the machinery. Behind one of the main galleries, search teams discovered signs of slave labor, the unmistakable fingerprints of Middle Baldora, the subterranean factory where tens of thousands of prisoners had been forced to assemble V2 rockets under brutal, lethal conditions. Wooden clogs were scattered near a drainage ditch. Shallow sleeping recesses had been gouged directly into the walls, barely large enough for a body. Someone had scratched tallies into a beam, short, vertical marks, clustered in groups of 5, extending for several feet. No one knew whether they counted days, dead workers, or just the passing misery of survival underground. For the American soldiers, the discovery was more than tactical. It was moral shock. Yet the most alarming revelation was architectural. Some chambers were enormous, so large they could have housed the two-stage rocket configuration sketched by Wernher von Braun's engineers in their theoretical papers. The aggregate A9-A10 series had been considered visionary, even fantastical, an intercontinental concept intended, in its most ambitious form, to strike targets thousands of miles away. Most Allied intelligence officers had dismissed it as impossible within wartime constraints. But here, deep beneath an unsuspecting forest, was space deliberately carved large enough for something greater than the V2's 46-foot frame. In a dim alcove, an intelligence officer unfolded captured documents cross-referenced with what lay before him. He whispered the question that had been growing in everyone's mind. Were these aimed at London or New York? Rumors of German long-range aspirations had circulated for months, but seeing infrastructure that could plausibly support such ambitions rewrote every assumption the Allies had made about the war's technological horizon. Messages shot up the chain of command to SHAEF headquarters. Analysts pored over reconnaissance photos. Patrols were redirected. If one such site existed, there could be others, larger, deeper, closer to completion. The fear wasn't just what the Germans had built, but what they were about to. Back in the cavernous chamber, engineers stared at the unfinished frames towering in the dim, industrial glow, trying to imagine the machines they were meant to hold. If the war had lasted 6 more months, what would have launched from these chambers? Once the first ghost factories were uncovered, the discovery triggered more than curiosity. It ignited a full-scale intelligence race. Within hours, U.S. Army technical teams, British scientific advisors, and OSS field officers were coordinating what they called rapid exploitation, a frantic effort to map, catalog, and secure every hidden V-weapon complex before the Germans could destroy evidence or finish construction. The hunter now became the hunted, and the Allies feared they were days or weeks behind. Air reconnaissance, once focused almost entirely on rail yards and oil refineries, shifted its lens. Pilots began re-examining forests, abandoned quarries, and stretches of mountain shadow where previous photos had shown little of interest. What analysts now saw with fresh eyes was alarming. Unexplained track marks leading into hillsides, ventilation outlets where none should exist, camouflaged roads branching toward nowhere. Each clue hinted at another underground world. Ground forces pressing deeper into Germany confirmed it. The battlefront was no longer only above ground. Units advancing through the Ruhr, the Harz Mountains, and Lower Saxony all reported the same pattern: sealed tunnels, blast doors, machine halls hollowed out of stone. At Mittelwerk, the massive subterranean complex near Nordhausen, American troops found the heart of V-2 production, a facility worked by thousands of slave laborers from the Mittelbau-Dora camp. The scale dwarfed anything previously imagined. Stretches of tunnel ran for miles, illuminated by rusting lamps still fixed to the ceiling. Huge assembly cradles stood abandoned mid-operation, their rivets left half-driven. Farther north, at places like Rheinhausen, Haslach, and Lies, soldiers uncovered even more specialized installations, sites equipped for fuel refinement, precision component machining, and long-term storage. Some were barely started. Others were disturbingly close to operational. Engineers estimated that certain factories could have produced dozens of V-2 components per week once completed, enough to sustain a launch campaign that could have battered London, Antwerp, and perhaps new targets far beyond Europe. But amidst the machinery came a human reckoning. U.S. soldiers described scenes of profound horror: starving laborers left behind by fleeing SS guards, too weak to stand, their faces lit only by dim carbide lamps. Some had been trapped underground for days without food. Others lay huddled near furnaces or vent shafts, trying to absorb the fading warmth of machines they had been forced to tend. In reports later filed by American medical officers, one recurring sentence appeared again and again: these men were worked until death. The relief of capturing unfinished installations collided with the realization of how close Germany had come. The V-2 had already proven impossible to intercept. Had these complexes reached full production capacity, the assault on Allied cities could have intensified dramatically. Worse still, scattered among the documents recovered were sketches and notes suggesting ambitions beyond Europe, trajectory calculations for extreme-range rockets, range tables extending toward the Atlantic, and timetables projecting output into 1946 and 1947. Inside a makeshift command post, intelligence teams laid out maps marked with lines arcing westward, calculations scribbled in German along the margins. They weren't theoretical doodles. They were planning documents, evidence of a future war that Germany intended to fight with machines born in darkness. The Allies had invaded Germany to end a war, not to find the blueprints for the next one. The discoveries in the forests and mountains of Germany did not remain battlefield curiosities for long. Within days, Allied command realized that the underground complexes were more than remnants of a collapsing regime. They were windows into a future no nation had fully imagined. Secure guards were posted. Entire convoys were redirected. Documents, blueprints, half-finished components, and even dismantled engines were packed into crates and flown out under armed escort. The race to capture the last of Hitler's technology had begun. For the United States, the response came in the form of Operation Paperclip. German engineers, some complicit in the forced labor system that powered V-weapon construction, were quietly gathered, questioned, and in many cases transported to America. Men like Wernher von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and their teams carried with them the mathematics and engineering principles that had driven the V2 program. But now, they would be directed toward American research labs and military proving grounds. It was a decision born as much from fear as ambition. Reports indicated that the Soviet army, sweeping through eastern Germany, had discovered its own share of launch sites, research papers, and scientists. Stalin's intelligence chiefs immediately recognized their value. What had begun as the last technological gasp of Nazi Germany became the opening move of a new geopolitical struggle, a missile race that would define the next half-century. Yet for the American soldiers who first stepped into those underground chambers, geopolitics felt distant. Their memories were not of blueprints or rocket frames, but of human suffering. Many had walked past the bodies of slave laborers who never made it out. Men worked to exhaustion, starved, beaten, and left as the SS fled. Medical teams who entered places like Mittelbau later wrote that some survivors were so weak they could not lift a cup. There was a moral fracture in the aftermath. On one hand, the Allies vowed to expose and prosecute the brutality discovered underground. On the other, governments recognized the extraordinary scientific leverage hidden in those same tunnels. Technology built through unimaginable cruelty was now the foundation of the world's next generation of weapons, and no Allied nation was willing to let its rivals gain a monopoly over it. Amid the machinery and documents, soldiers recorded their own reactions. One wrote, "This wasn't defense, this was preparation." Another, upon seeing the scale of the unfinished rocket chambers, remarked, "They were building weapons for a future we would never want to see." And yet, that future arrived. By the late 1940s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were testing ballistic missiles directly descended from German designs. The V2's legacy, born in the tunnels of Nordhausen, assembled by men who were never meant to survive, became the blueprint for everything from the Cold War arms race to the dawn of space exploration. The hidden V-weapon sites revealed the collision of desperation, ideology, and technological ambition that marked the final year of the war. They showed how far a regime would go in pursuit of visions unrestrained by ethics or humanity, and the immense cost buried beneath every brick and beam. What American soldiers uncovered in those forests wasn't just the end of Hitler's war. It was the beginning of the missile age.